Hello again. I'm going to read a chapter of Toro Toro. This book's really good. If you can get hold of this, I recommend it very much. It's got lots of history of Spain in there. It's by Michael Morpurgo and brilliant book. So I'm going to just read it. I am a proud grandfather of a wonderful grandson. I've been for 8 years. The two of us are very close. Somehow we know each other instinctively, like twins, in spite of the 60 years between us. We even share the same name. Nowadays they call me Abuelo, Grandpa. But when I was little, I was always called Antonito, like him. It isn't only by his name that Antonito reminds me of me. Until yesterday, being a grandfather had been a simple joy, all the pleasures of fatherhood and a few of the cares and woes. And yesterday afternoon, up in his bedroom, Antonito asked me a question that had to be answered properly, honestly, and without circumvention. It was a little enough thing that began it. It happened during the siesta. Antonito was bored and he was just messing around as children do, and all he did was kick a football through a window, by accident. Then his mother came storming out of the garden. Antonito was standing there in his Barcelona shirt, looking as guilty as sin. He hadn't run off, he's not like that. There was no one else around except the cat and me, and we were having our afternoon nap under the mimosa tree at the bottom of the garden. Well, anyway, Antonito had to be the culprit, and he was for it, and there was nothing I could do to help him. Antonito, how many times have I told you? I could see that the chin of his was jutting already, and I knew there'd be tears welling up inside him. I could sense what he was going to say before he even said it. I didn't do it. It wasn't me. Honest. And that was all said with such utter conviction, such determined defiance. Asked for an alternative explanation, he shrugged insolently at his mother, pursed his lips, and refused to speak. That one shrug was enough to send his mother into paroxysms of rage, and he was a careless, thoughtless, lying little toad, and he should be ashamed of himself. Antonito was banished to his bedroom. For some time afterwards, I could hear him crying and then whimpering quietly in his misery and his shame. I longed to go up and console him, but I had to bide my time until I was sure his mother had gone out. Grandfathers have to be careful in such matters. Before making my way into the house and upstairs, I knocked and opened the door. Antonito was sitting on his bed, chin still jutting, until he saw me. "Hello, old fellow," I said, and I went in to sit down next to him. Neither of us could think what to say, so we said nothing. We often said nothing together. We were silent for some time. Then out of the silence came the question. "Abuelo, when you were little, did you ever do bad things? I mean, really bad. Did you ever tell a lie?" "Plenty," I said. And this was quite true, of course, but I should have left it at that. Instead, seeking to empathise and wanting to make him feel better, I went on. "I'm telling you, Antonito, I was a whole lot better at bad things than you are. And as for lying, I was pretty good at that too." He looked up at me with his wide eyes. "Honestly," he said. "Honestly," I replied. "Would I lie to you, Antonito?" He smiled at that and brushed the tear stains from his cheeks. I felt I'd said the right thing. "Are you going to come down now and pick up that glass with me?" I asked. "And then we can make peace with your mother when she comes back, can't you?" But I could tell he wasn't listening to me, even as I was speaking. "Abuelo," he said, "when you were little, what was the very worstest thing you ever did?" I hadn't thought he would take it any further, and now I was on the spot. I had a mountain of the worstest things to choose from, but he'd asked me for the very worstest, and I knew at once what that was. I'd told no one else in near enough 70 years. Not the real story, not all of it. It seemed somehow the moment now to tell it. And it seemed too that if anyone had the right to know, it was my grandson. I felt it was in some way his birthright, his inheritance. I knew too that he expected the truth from me, so I told him the truth, the whole truth. If I tell you something, Antonito, I said, it will have to be our secret. No one else must know, not until you're a father yourself. And then you can tell your own children. That's only as it should be. After all, it's our history I'm talking about. Yours and theirs too. Not a word till then. Promise? Promise, he said. And I knew he meant it. I could feel his eyes willing me on, so I began. I haven't always lived here in town in Malaga, but you know that already, don't you? I've told you that before, haven't I? How I was born on a farm, how I grew up in the countryside with all the animals all around me. Over the years, I told him dozens of tales about my country childhood in Andalusia. He loved to hear all about the animals, but I promised him something much more exciting this time, and I could see he was full of expectation. This is not just another of my animal stories, Antonito. Well, in one sense it is, I suppose, but this is the most important story I could tell you, because this story changed my life forever. I'll begin at the beginning, shall I? I will pause there. I was born in the small farmhouse just outside the village of Sauceda on the 1st of May, 1930. There was my older sister Maria, 10 years older than me to the day, and mother and father, just the four of us. We had uncles and aunts and cousins all around, of course. The whole village was like one big family, but we can skip all that. It was another birth about 5 years after my own that really began it all. The farm didn't belong to my father. Hardly anybody owned the land they worked on in those days. They just farmed it. It was a hard life, but I knew little of that. For me, it was a magical place to grow up. There were cork forests all around. We'd harvest the cork, cut it off the trees every 9 years to make corks for wine bottles. We had our little black pigs wandering everywhere and dozens of goats for our milk and cheese. And chickens too. Never short of eggs for an omelette. We had mules too, bringing the cork down from the hillsides, and the horses. Everyone had horses or mules in those days, and I could ride almost as soon as I could walk. But mostly it was cows we kept. Not those lovely reddy brown rositos you often see out in the countryside. Ours were black and beautiful and brave. My father bred only black bulls. Bulls for the corrida, for the bull ring. We must have had 50 or 60 of them, I suppose, counting all the calves. Magnificent they were. The best in all Andalusia, my father always said. As a small boy, I'd spent hours and hours standing on the fence, just watching them, marvelling at their wild eyes, their wicked horns, their shining coats. I loved it when they lifted their heads and snorted at me, and then they would paw the ground, kicking up great clouds of dust and dirt. To me, they were simply the noblest, most exciting creatures on God's earth. At that age, though, I had no real idea, no understanding of what they were kept for. They were just out there grazing in their corrals, part of the landscape of my life. I didn't ask such questions, not at 5 years old. Out in the cork forest, I'd seen the red deer in amongst the trees and the wild boar bolting through the undergrowth and the griffin vultures floating high up in the sky. I didn't ask what they were there for either. Life seems simple enough when you're 5 years old. And then Paco came, and the war came, and the bombing planes came. And nothing was ever simple again. There was a terrible thunderstorm the night that Paco was born. Father asked me if I was frightened, I remember, and I said no, which wasn't true. And Maria said I was, and she and I fought like cats sometimes, but I thought the world of her, and she thought the world of me. So that's why I went outside into the storm with Father that night to prove to Maria that I wasn't afraid. I followed Father's swinging lantern across the yard to the barn, hoping and praying the lightning wouldn't see the lantern and strike us dead. The mother cow was laying down when we got to the barn, and 2 little white feet were already showing from under her tail. I looked on as Father crouched down behind her, took the calf by his feet, leaned back and hauled on him, and there was some grunting and groaning from both Father and the cow, but there was very little blood, and it was quickly over, and the calf slipped out quite easily. There he lay, shining black and steaming in the straw, shaking his head free of the clinging membrane. Ugh. Bull, Father told me. We've got a fine little bull. He knelt over him, lifted his head and poked a piece of straw down his nostrils. That'll help him breathe better, he said. The cow was trying to get to her feet, and Father moved smartly away and took me with him. She was bellowing at us and giving us the evil eye, making it very clear that she didn't want us anywhere near her calf. But try as she might, the cow could not get up on her feet. She just didn't seem to have the strength. Time and again she almost made it, but then her legs would collapse and she would be down again. In the end she gave up and sat there breathing heavily and looking bewildered and frightened. Father did all he could to help her, but her only response now was to toss her horns at him angrily. He shouted and whooped at her, clapped her sides, twisted her tail, anything to panic her up onto her feet, but nothing would shift her. That calf has to drink soon, he said, or he won't live, and he won't be able to drink unless she stands up. I joined in now, screaming at the cow to get up, slapping her, jumping up and down, but she just couldn't do it. She was stretched on her side now, completely exhausted by her efforts. Only one thing for it, said Father, crouching down beside her. He stripped some milk from her udder into a bucket, and then he poured it into a bottle with a teat. On it, with a teat on it. He lifted the calf's head and dribbled the milk down his throat until at last he suckled. All the time, though, he was struggling against it, fighting the bottle, fighting Father. We've got a brave one here, said Father. I'll hold him, Antonito, you feed him. And he handed me the bottle. So there I was, feeding the calf by myself. I talked to him as I fed him, and he was calmer at once. I told him how beautiful he was, and he was going to be the finest bull in all of Spain, and he sucked, and as he sucked, his eyes looked into mine, and mine into his, and I loved him. After a while, Father had no need to hold him any more. I told Father he should be called Paco, and Father said that was a fine name, a proper name for such a brave bull. But I could see Father was becoming more and more anxious about Paco's mother. She was weakening all the time, and despite his best efforts, it was only a couple of hours later that she breathed one last sigh and died. Oh. And that one night, I had witnessed my first birth and my first death.